The moment you start thinking for yourself, you become dangerous to a world that wants you to think like everyone else. Most people don't question the crowd. They follow trends, repeat opinions, and seek safety and agreement because standing alone feels uncomfortable. But the second you begin forming your own judgments, rejecting popular nonsense, and living by your own principles, something strange happens. You start losing approval. People become uncomfortable with your independence. They question your choices. Some may even reject you entirely. Stoicism understood this truth centuries ago. The price of independent thinking is often loneliness, but the reward is freedom, because the strongest minds are not built by following the crowd. They are built by having the courage to stand apart from it. And sometimes, the more you grow into your true self, the less you fit into the world that preferred the weaker version of you. And nobody warns you about this part. Nobody sits you down and says, hey, the day you start using your own mind, the people around you are going to feel something they can't explain, and that feeling is going to come out as judgment, as distance, as silence. Nobody prepares you for the strange grief of outgrowing rooms you once felt completely at home in. You don't just lose people. You lose a version of yourself that was easy for the world to digest, a version that smiled at the right times, agreed at the right moments, and never made anyone feel the discomfort of an unanswered question. But here's what psychology tells us about this. And this is something most people never hear. When a person begins to develop what psychologists call self-authorship, the ability to define your own values instead of borrowing them from your environment, the people closest to you unconsciously feel threatened. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your growth holds up a mirror, and most people are not ready to look at themselves in that mirror. So they do what humans have always done when something makes them uncomfortable. They push it away. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But what he didn't say, what nobody says, is that using that power will cost you. It will cost you friendships. It will cost you belonging. It will cost you the version of yourself that kept everyone else comfortable at the expense of your own soul. And yet, you are still here, still watching, still thinking, still refusing to go back to sleep. That means something. That means everything. Because the people who are watching this right now, they are not ordinary. Ordinary people switched off 3 minutes ago. The ones still here are the ones who have felt this rejection personally, who have sat alone in a room and wondered why their clarity felt like a curse. Who have been told they were too deep, too serious, too much, by people who were simply not enough to handle them. This video is for those people, for you. What I am about to walk you through are 5 psychological and spiritual truths about why independent thinking makes society uncomfortable and why that discomfort is not your problem to fix. It is your proof that you are evolving. Stay locked in. Drop in the comments. I think free. Now, let's get into it. Point 1. When you stop needing their approval, they stop knowing how to control you. There is something that happens inside a person the moment they stop needing approval. Something quiet. Something that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come with a celebration or a breakthrough moment. It comes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, when someone says something designed to make you feel small, and for the first time in your life, it just doesn't land. You hear the words, you register them, and then you simply move on. Not because you forced yourself to, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped handing people the remote control to your emotions. And that is when the dynamic shifts completely. See, most relationships, and this is something social psychology has documented deeply, are built on invisible contracts. You behave in a way that keeps the other person comfortable, and in return, they give you acceptance. You shrink your opinions, soften your edges, laugh at things that aren't funny, and agree with things you don't actually believe. And as long as you keep playing your role in that contract, everything feels fine. But the moment you stop, the moment you start showing up as your actual self with actual opinions and actual boundaries, the contract breaks. And people who were only comfortable with the version of you that needed them will start to feel deeply, personally threatened by the version of you that doesn't. They won't say that directly. They never do. Instead, they'll call you arrogant. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you think you're better than everyone now. They'll dress up their loss of control over you in the language of concern. I'm just worried about you. You're not the same person anymore. And what they mean, underneath all of it, is that you stopped being manageable. You stopped being predictable. You stopped being someone they could shape with guilt, silence, or disapproval. Epictetus, a man who was literally born into slavery and still became one of the greatest Stoic philosophers in history, said something that cuts straight to the bone. Seek not the good in external things, seek it in yourself. He understood this at a level most people never will, because he had nothing, no status, no freedom, no approval from the world around him, and yet he was psychologically untouchable, because he had stopped outsourcing his worth to people who never deserved to hold it. That is the real power that society fears, not your talent, not your intelligence, not your ambition, your detachment. The moment you become someone who can walk into a room full of disapproval and still know exactly who you are, you become something most people have never encountered. And what people don't understand, they instinctively try to destroy. Don't let them. Your freedom from their opinions is not coldness. It is not ego. It is the most spiritual form of self-respect a human being can develop. And the people who call it arrogance are usually the ones who are most addicted to your approval. Point 2. The people who walked away were never built for the person you were becoming. There is a specific kind of pain that nobody talks about honestly, not the pain of losing someone to death or distance, but the pain of watching someone choose to leave because you grew, because you changed, because you became more, and more was something they couldn't stand next to without feeling less. That kind of loss doesn't have a clean name. It doesn't get sympathy cards or check-in messages from friends. It just sits inside you quietly, like a room in your house that you walk past, but never fully open. And the cruelest part is, you start to wonder if your growth was the mistake. You start to replay the conversations, second-guess the decisions. Ask yourself whether it would have been better to just stay the same. Stay small. Stay in the version of yourself that everyone was comfortable with. Because at least back then, the room was full. At least back then, nobody was leaving. But here is the psychological truth that most people are never told. And it is one of the most important things you will hear. Psychologists who study human development call it relational pruning, the natural, inevitable process by which the relationships that were built on who you used to be simply cannot survive the person you are becoming. It is not betrayal. It is not failure. It is biology. It is growth. A tree does not apologize for the branches that fall away when it grows taller. It just keeps growing. The people who left, they were not equipped for your evolution. And that is not a cruel thing to say. It is simply true. Some people enter your life as companions for a chapter, not the whole story. They were there for a version of you that needed what they offered at that time. The comfort, the familiarity, the mirror of who you were before you started asking harder questions about yourself and the world around you. But when you started changing, when you started reading deeper, thinking longer, sitting with discomfort instead of running from it, you became someone they didn't recognize. And instead of being curious about who you were becoming, they became afraid. because your growth reminded them of the growing they had chosen not to do. Carl Jung understood this on a level that still feels almost uncomfortably personal. He wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And what he meant was this: when you begin the journey of true self-acceptance, of genuine inner work, the world around you will not applaud you. The world will resist you. Because a person who has accepted themselves fully cannot be manipulated by shame, cannot be controlled by the fear of rejection, cannot be kept small by the opinions of people who have never done the work themselves. The ones who walked away were protecting themselves from what you represent. A living, breathing reminder that change is possible, and they were choosing not to change. Let them go. Completely. Without bitterness and without ceremony, because the space they left behind was not emptiness. It was room. Room for the relationships that are built on who you actually are, not who you used to perform being. Point 3. Your silence makes them nervous because they expected your collapse. Here is something deeply unsettling to certain people when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop showing up to every argument you are invited to, when you simply go quiet, not out of weakness, not out of defeat, but out of a deep, unshakable understanding that not every person deserves access to your inner world. And what happens next is one of the most fascinating and revealing things about human psychology. The people who expected your breakdown start to panic when your breakthrough arrives instead. They were waiting for you to fall apart. And this is something most people never consciously realize is happening to them. When you are going through your transformation, when you are pulling away from toxic dynamics, rebuilding your mindset, choosing solitude over shallow company, the people around you who benefited from your confusion, your insecurity, your need for their validation, they are quietly counting on your return. They expect that the silence is temporary, that the growth is a phase, that eventually the pressure of loneliness will crack you open and send you crawling back to the comfort of who you used to be. But you don't go back. And your refusal to collapse becomes the most powerful statement you never had to make out loud. See, in human psychology, there is something called narcissistic injury, the deep psychological wound that occurs in people who need to feel superior when the person they expected to stay beneath them simply refuses to. It doesn't require grand confrontations. It doesn't require arguments or announcements. Your simple, quiet, consistent growth is enough to destabilize someone who built their sense of self around your limitations. Your peace disturbs them. Your progress threatens them. Your silence, that calm, unbothered, deeply rooted silence, becomes louder than anything you could have ever said. Seneca wrote, "Retire into yourself as much as you can." And most people read that as advice about solitude. But it runs so much deeper than that. It is a psychological directive. It is Seneca telling you, stop performing your pain for an audience that is rooting for your suffering. Stop explaining your journey to people who are not equipped to understand your destination. Stop making yourself available to every person who wants to pull you back into the version of yourself they could manage. Or, your silence is not absence, it is armor, and the most spiritually mature thing a person can do when the world expects them to crumble, when people are watching for cracks, when the pressure is designed to break you, is to simply keep building, keep reading, keep growing, keep showing up for yourself in the dark when nobody is watching and nobody is applauding. Because that is where real character is forged. Not in the moments where the whole world is cheering for you, but in the quiet, unglamorous, deeply private moments where you choose yourself over and over again, even when it costs you everything. They expected your collapse. Give them your character instead. Point 4. Society doesn't reject you because you are wrong. It rejects you because you are awake. Let me say something that is going to hit differently than anything you have heard before. The world does not reject bad people nearly as aggressively as it rejects awakened ones. Bad people are tolerated. Mediocre people are celebrated. People who cause harm, but do it quietly, within the acceptable boundaries of social performance, are invited to every table. But the person who wakes up, the person who starts seeing through the performance, questioning the systems, refusing to numb themselves with distraction and consumption and empty validation, that person gets pushed to the edges. That person gets labeled. That person gets handled with a particular kind of social hostility that is disguised so carefully it almost looks like concern. And the reason for this is something that goes straight to the core of human psychology. Human beings are, at their fundamental nature, comfort-seeking creatures, not truth-seeking, not growth-seeking, comfort-seeking. And when you become someone who has chosen truth over comfort, growth over familiarity, depth over ease, you become a living disruption to every person around you who has chosen the opposite. Your very existence asks a question they are desperately trying not to answer. Your choices make their choices visible. Your awareness makes their numbness impossible to ignore. And nobody wants to be reminded of the life they are not living while they are standing right next to someone who is living it fully. So they reject you, not because something is broken in you, but because something has awakened in you that terrifies them. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoic philosophy, built an entire school of thought on one radical premise, that the only true good is virtue, not approval, not status, not belonging, virtue, inner alignment, the courage to live according to your own values, regardless of what the crowd demands from you. He was mocked for it, dismissed for it, and then history remembered him while his critics dissolved into anonymity, because that is always how it ends. The ones who laughed at Galileo are unnamed. The ones who rejected Einstein are forgotten. The ones who dismissed every awakened mind that ever walked this earth have left no mark on history whatsoever. But the awakened minds themselves, they changed everything. Not because the world welcomed them, but because they refused to shrink themselves to fit a world that was too small for what they carried. You are carrying something too. Something that the noise of daily life keeps trying to bury. Something that the pressure of social approval keeps trying to silence. Something that every rejection, every dismissal, every moment of being misunderstood has been slowly, painfully, but undeniably sharpening into something extraordinary. Your awakening is not your burden. It is your inheritance. And the world's rejection of it is not your verdict. It is your evidence that you are no longer asleep. Point 5. The loneliness you feel is not emptiness. It is the sound of you finally meeting yourself. There is a loneliness that comes with growth that is unlike any other kind of loneliness a human being can experience. It is not the loneliness of being abandoned. It is not the loneliness of being unloved. It is something far more complex and far more difficult to explain to someone who has never felt it. It is the loneliness of standing in a room full of people and realizing, with absolute clarity, that not a single person in that room can meet you where you actually live. Not because they are bad people, not because you are better than them, but because you have traveled somewhere inside yourself that they have simply never been. And the distance between where you are and where they are is not measurable in words or arguments or explanations. It just exists, quietly, permanently, like a wall made of invisible glass. And most people, when they feel this, run from it immediately. They fill the silence with noise. They fill the emptiness with people who don't actually see them. They go back to old habits, old friendships, old versions of themselves, not because those things served them, but because the alternative feels unbearable. The alternative is sitting alone with yourself long enough to actually hear what is happening inside you. And that for most people, is the most terrifying thing in the entire world. But here is what nobody tells you about that loneliness. Here is the part that changes everything when you finally understand it. That loneliness is not a sign that something is missing. It is a sign that something has arrived. It is the sound of you finally, after years of performing and people-pleasing and shrinking and explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand you anyway, finally meeting yourself. The real version. Not the version built for approval. Not the version designed to make others comfortable. The version that exists when nobody is watching. The version that reads at midnight and asks questions the world finds inconvenient and feels things at a depth that most people spend their entire lives running from. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological journey of becoming who you truly are, beneath all the layers of social conditioning, family expectation, and cultural programming. And he was deeply honest about what that journey costs. He said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." That is not poetic language. That is a precise psychological diagnosis of exactly what you have been living through. You have been carrying a depth that your environment was not built to hold, and so the environment rejected you, not because you were wrong for it, but because you were too much for it, too awake, too feeling, too alive in a world that rewards numbness and punishes sensitivity, too committed to truth in a culture that has built entire industries around comfortable lies. But here is the part that should set something on fire inside you. Every single person throughout history who changed something, who built something, who wrote something, who discovered something that the world initially called impossible, every single one of them sat exactly where you are sitting right now. In that same loneliness, in that same room of invisible glass, wondering whether their depth was a gift or a curse, wondering whether the isolation would ever end, wondering whether anyone would ever truly see them. And they kept going anyway. Not because it got easier, but because they made a decision, a quiet, unannounced, deeply personal decision, that their own truth mattered more than the comfort of belonging to a world that was too small for them. That is the decision in front of you right now. Not a dramatic decision, not a loud one. Just the simple, daily, relentless choice to keep meeting yourself honestly, to keep growing in the direction your soul is pulling you, to stop apologizing for the depth of your own mind, to let the loneliness be what it actually is. Not your punishment, but your preparation. Not your failure, but your foundation. The most powerful version of you was never going to be built in a crowd. It was always going to be built here, in the silence, in the solitude, in the moments that looked like loneliness from the outside, but were actually, if you look closely enough, the most important conversations you have ever had, the ones you had with yourself. The world was never going to understand you. It was only ever going to need you. Everything we have walked through in this video comes down to one single truth, that Stoicism has been trying to hand humanity for over 2,000 years, and that most people are still too afraid to accept. The life that is built for approval will always be a life that belongs to someone else. Every person who ever lived fully, whoever created something real, stood for something meaningful, or became someone genuinely worth becoming, did it by making peace with being misunderstood. Not by fixing the misunderstanding, not by explaining themselves until people finally accepted them, but by reaching a place inside themselves where the misunderstanding simply stopped having power over their direction. That place exists inside you too. It has always existed inside you, underneath the self-doubt, underneath the years of shrinking, underneath every moment you swallowed your real opinion to keep the peace, every time you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, every night you lay awake wondering why the world felt so loud and you felt so alone inside it. Marcus Aurelius, a man who carried the weight of an entire empire on his back, came back to one principle his entire life: that the quality of your inner world is the only thing that is ever truly yours. Everything outside of it is noise. Everything outside of it is temporary. Everything outside of it was never the point. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to wake up. And now that you are awake, stay there. Stay in your depth. Stay in your questions. Stay in the beautiful, difficult, uncommon territory of a mind that refuses to stop growing. The world didn't reject you because you were too little. It rejected you because you were always too much for the cage it was trying to put you in. And you were never meant to live in a cage. Final comment to drop. I was born free.